By the autumn of 1944, the Wehrmacht was a ghost of its former self. While propaganda films in Berlin still spoke of Endsieg, or final victory, the reality on the front lines was measured in grams of sawdust. The average German soldier, once the best fed in Europe, was now surviving on a starvation diet. Their rations consisted of Kommissbrot, a dense, dark bread frequently extended with sawdust to save flour, and a bitter, muddy liquid known as ersatz coffee, brewed from roasted acorns and chicory. The German military doctrine was built on iron will, but it was collapsing under the weight of biological failure. A soldier cannot hold a line when his body is consuming its own muscle for fuel. Everything changed the moment these soldiers crossed the wire into American captivity. The transition was a psychological ambush. Upon entering the collection points near cities like Aachen, German prisoners weren't met with the starvation they had been promised by their officers. Instead, they were confronted by the terrifying reality of American industrial abundance. The first weapon of the American occupation wasn't a gun, it was a tray of food. German prisoners were handed white bread, refined, soft, and bleached, a luxury that had vanished from the Third Reich years prior. Along with it came real butter, canned meats, and the ultimate symbol of American surplus, the Hershey's chocolate bar. For the German soldier, this was a moment of total cognitive dissonance. They had been told that the United States was a decadent, fractured nation on the brink of collapse, yet here was an army that possessed so much excess that even its prisoners were eating better than German front-line officers. The white bread shock became a documented phenomenon among POWs. As they sat in the mud of the Rhineland, chewing on American chocolate, the realization began to spread through the ranks like a virus. You cannot defeat a nation that treats sugar and white flour as a standard battlefield supply. This wasn't just a meal, it was a surrender of the mind. The German soldier realized that while they were fighting a war of scarcity and will, the Americans were fighting a war of calories and industrial output. The war wasn't lost because of a tactical error or a missed command. It was lost because the American factory system had made the German concept of sacrifice irrelevant.
The German military machine was built for the sprint. It was an army designed for short, sharp, decisive blows, the blitzkrieg. But by 1944, the war had turned into a marathon, and Germany was running on bare feet while America was riding in a fleet of trucks. To the German prisoner of war being transported away from the front, the most terrifying sight wasn't the American tanks or the heavy artillery. It was the road itself. For the German Lanzer, transport was synonymous with the horse. Despite the images of motorized divisions in propaganda reels, the vast majority of the German army, nearly 80%, relied on animal power. Throughout the war, the Wehrmacht utilized over 2.75 million horses. By 1944, these horses were dying in droves, unable to find fodder or keep pace with the mechanized retreat. But as the prisoners sat in the back of American-made GMC and Studebaker trucks, they saw a different world. The United States didn't just have a few motorized divisions, they had a motorized civilization. By the end of the war, the U.S. had produced over 2.4 million tactical vehicles. To the German soldier, the sight of an endless column of trucks, each one burning high-octane fuel as if it were an infinite resource, was a physical blow to their morale. In Germany, fuel was a precious synthetic liquid squeezed from coal. In the American army, it was a river that never ran dry. The scale of this logistical excess reached a point that bordered on the absurd. One of the most famous accounts from German veterans involves the discovery of a special American transport. In the middle of a war zone, surrounded by ruins and death, German scouts would occasionally capture American supply trucks. They expected to find ammunition or medicine. Instead, they found crates of fresh, frosted birthday cakes and frozen ice cream. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated display of industrial power. The U.S. Navy actually commissioned a floating ice cream parlor, a concrete barge capable of producing 1,500 gallons of ice cream every hour, specifically to serve sailors in the Pacific. To a German soldier who hadn't seen a fresh egg in a year, the fact that his enemy had the spare logistics capacity to ship frozen desserts across an ocean was the ultimate psychological defeat. It proved that the American war effort was so efficient that they could treat luxury as a basic infantry requirement. But how was this possible? To understand the 20-minute reality of this industrial monster, we have to look at the Liberty ship. These were the ugly modular pack mules of the Atlantic. Before the war, a single ship took over 200 days to build. American industrialist Henry Kaiser applied the assembly line techniques of the Ford Motor Company to shipbuilding. By 1943, Liberty ships were being launched in an average of 39 days. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, was famously assembled in just 4 days and 15 hours. For every German U-boat that sank a merchant vessel, the Americans were launching 2 more. It was an industrial math problem that Germany could not solve. The prisoners watching from the docks of Cherbourg or Marseille saw a ship being unloaded every few minutes. They saw thousands of tons of material, not just bullets, but toothbrushes, cigarettes, Coca-Cola, and specialized cold weather gear pouring onto the continent. This led to a phenomenon known as logistical terror. German officers began to realize that they weren't just fighting a superior tactical force, they were fighting a production rate. They could destroy an American tank platoon in the morning, and by the afternoon, a fresh platoon would arrive, having been offloaded from a ship just miles away. The psychological weight of this excess changed the very nature of the combatant. The German soldier fought with fanatical energy because he knew he was at the end of his rope. The American soldier fought with a methodical confidence because he knew the steel mountain was behind him. As the German prisoners were shipped towards the United States, crossing an ocean they were told was controlled by their U-boats, they saw the truth. The Atlantic was an American highway. By the time the POWs reached the American coastline, the shock had evolved into a quiet, bitter acceptance. They saw cities lit up at night, untouched by bombers. They saw parking lots full of private cars. They realized that while Germany had sacrificed its entire youth and future for a total war, the United States had fought the most expensive war in history while simultaneously increasing its civilian standard of living. The logistics of excess was the final nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. It proved that in the 20th century, the nation with the most trucks, the most calories, and the most ships would always outlast the nation with the most will. The war wasn't won in a single battle. It was won in the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of Richmond, delivered to the front in a truck full of ice cream and birthday cake.
When the German prisoners finally reached the American coastline, they expected to find a landscape ravaged by the same total war that had leveled their own cities. They had been told that New York was in ruins and that the American people were starving under the pressure of the U-boat blockade. Instead, they stepped off the transport ships into a world of blinding light and impossible normalcy. As they were moved by train toward the interior of the country, they looked out the windows at cities that were lit up like Christmas trees at night, untouched by blackouts or bombs. They saw parking lots filled with private automobiles and civilians who walked with a confident, hurried pace that suggested they weren't even aware a war was happening. This was the first stage of the democratic shock.
the realization that the United States was so vast and so powerful that it could wage a global war on two oceans while its homeland remained a paradise of consumer comfort. The journey ended in camps scattered across the American heartland, from the deserts of Arizona to the farmlands of Mississippi. Here, the German soldier encountered a system of captivity that defied every piece of propaganda he had ever consumed. According to the Geneva Convention, which the United States followed with an almost bureaucratic obsession, prisoners were not to be mistreated, but the reality went far beyond mere safety. The Germans were housed in barracks that were often better than the housing they had left behind in the ruins of the Reich. They were paid for their labor in canteen coupons, allowing them to buy luxuries like cigarettes, beer, and candy at the post exchange. To a man who had been told that Americans were uncivilized gangsters, the sight of an American guard treating him with professional indifference rather than ideological hatred was a profound source of confusion. The most unsettling realization, however, came from the social fabric of the American military itself. The German army was a rigid hierarchy based on leadership and blood, but in the American camps, the prisoners saw a messy, loud, and surprisingly efficient democracy in action. They watched as American officers and enlisted men interacted with a level of familiarity that would have been grounds for a court-martial in the Wehrmacht. They saw that the American will wasn't fueled by a single dictator, but by a collective industrial consensus. More shockingly, many German prisoners were assigned to work on local farms, where they ate at the same tables as American families. They saw the abundance of the American farm, the massive tractors, the silos overflowing with grain, and the refrigerators stocked with meat. They began to understand that the American soldier wasn't fighting because he had to, but because he believed in the system that provided this lifestyle. Perhaps the most complex layer of this shock was the social and racial dynamic. Many German prisoners raised on the strict racial laws of the Nazi state were baffled to see black and white Americans working in the same industries, even if the military was still segregated at the time. The exposure to a multicultural society that still functioned with high efficiency shattered the core of the National Socialist argument that purity was the only path to strength. By the time these men were moved to the fields to pick cotton or harvest beets, the ideological war was already over in their minds. They weren't just prisoners of war, they were prisoners of a superior reality. They realized that the decadent democracy they had been taught to despise was actually a sprawling industrial giant that could afford to be kind to its enemies simply because it was too powerful to be threatened by them. The democratic shock wasn't just about freedom, it was about the realization that a free people, backed by an infinite factory, was the most dangerous force on Earth.
The end of the war did not bring an immediate homecoming for the millions of German men held in the vast network of American camps. While their homeland was being carved into zones of occupation and their families were scavenging through the rubble of Berlin and Hamburg, the prisoners remained in a state of suspended animation. When the time finally came for repatriation, the transition was perhaps the most brutal shock of all. These men, who had spent months or years being fed on a diet of American surplus, who had grown healthy, strong, and accustomed to the predictable rhythm of a functioning democracy, were loaded onto trains and ships to be sent back to a country that no longer existed. The return to the ruins was a journey into a nightmare. As the trains crossed the Rhine, the prisoners looked out at a landscape that resembled the surface of the moon. The bustling industrial Germany they had fought for had been pulverized into mountains of brick and twisted steel. There were no lit cities here, no parking lots full of cars, and no shelves overflowing with white bread. Instead, they found their mothers and wives standing in bread lines that stretched for blocks, waiting for a handful of gray, gritty flour.
The contrast between the paradise of their captivity and the hell of their homecoming created a deep psychological fracture. They had returned from a land of impossible excess to a land of absolute nothingness. This was the final, bitter realization of the German soldier. They understood that the enemy they had been taught to hate was the only reason they were still alive. Many returning soldiers carried small treasures hidden in their kits, scraps of American chocolate, bars of soap, or tins of meat they had managed to save from their rations. In the ruins of post-war Germany, these items were more valuable than gold. A single Hershey's bar could buy a week's worth of survival for a starving family. The American shock didn't mend with the war. It became the foundation for a new German identity. The men who had seen the American factory and the American farm became the most vocal advocates for the rebuilding of Germany along Western lines. They had seen the alternative, and they knew that the ideology of will had been crushed by the reality of abundance. The legacy of the German POW experience in America is one of the strangest footnotes in military history. Thousands of these men, once they had seen the scale of the United States and the kindness of its people, eventually moved back. In the decades following the war, a significant number of former prisoners immigrated to the very towns in the American Midwest or the South where they had once been held behind barbed wire. They didn't return as conquerors, but as neighbors, drawn back by the memory of a country that could afford to feed its enemies. The war wasn't just won by the M1 Garand or the Liberty ship. It was won by the profound, unsettling shock of a culture that had so much to give that even its cages were comfortable. For the German veteran, the ultimate defeat wasn't the surrender. It was the realization that the world they had tried to destroy was the only world worth living in.